The flight to nowhere. The early morning sky over Washington, D.C., was painted in soft shades of purple and orange as the sun prepared to rise. The city, always alive with movement, had begun to stir with the sounds of honking taxis, rumbling buses, and hurried footsteps of those who needed to be somewhere important. Sasha Obama, 21 years old and fiercely independent, pulled her coat tightly around her shoulders as she stepped out of the car in front of Reagan National Airport. Her driver, a friendly man named Leonard, opened the trunk and retrieved her suitcase. "You sure you don't want me to wait, Miss Obama?" Leonard asked, his voice laced with concern. Sasha smiled, shaking her head. "No, I've got it from here." "Thanks, Leo." He hesitated for a moment before nodding, tipping his cap. "Safe travels." Sasha exhaled, her breath forming a faint cloud in the crisp morning air. She adjusted the strap of her backpack and walked towards the automatic doors of the terminal. Today was a big day. She had been invited to speak at a prestigious youth conference in New York City, where young leaders from across the country would present their ideas on innovation, activism, and social change. The opportunity was huge, not because of her last name, but because of the research she had been working on tirelessly for months. Sasha was determined to make a name for herself beyond her father's legacy. She was not just Barack Obama's daughter. She was her own person, with her own ideas and her own voice. Yet even as she repeated that thought to herself, she knew reality wasn't always so simple. No matter how much she worked, no matter how many achievements she earned, people would always see her first as the daughter of a former president. That name carried power, but it also carried weight. It meant expectations, assumptions, and, most frustratingly, doubt. She was used to it. But today, she wouldn't let it get in her way. As she stepped inside the bustling airport, she pulled out her phone to check the time. 6:37 a.m. She was early, but not by much. Her flight was scheduled to board in less than an hour. Her shoes clicked against the polished floor as she maneuvered through the crowds, heading toward the business class check-in counter. People rushed past her, some yawning from too little sleep, others chugging down coffee as they hurried to their gates. The smell of breakfast sandwiches and brewed espresso filled the air. Overhead, the speakers blared flight announcements, barely audible over the chatter of travelers. When she reached the counter, Sasha placed her boarding pass and ID on the desk, smiling politely at the woman behind the counter. "Good morning," Sasha said, her tone polite but firm. The woman, M. Reynolds, barely glanced up at her. She was in her mid-40s, with a tight bun and an expression that suggested she had seen too many travelers and had no patience left. She grabbed Sasha's documents without a word. Sasha waited as the woman's eyes scanned her ID. Something in Reynolds' expression changed, a flicker of something Sasha had seen before. Recognition. Then, just as quickly, the woman's gaze hardened. She studied the ticket again, flipping it over as though expecting to find something wrong. The pause stretched just a little too long. "This ticket is for business class," Reynolds finally said. Her voice clipped. Sasha nodded. "Yes." Reynolds frowned, staring at her. "Are you sure this is your ticket?" Sasha blinked, taken aback by the question. "Yes, of course. Is there a problem?" The woman pursed her lips. She glanced at the ID again, then at Sasha, as if trying to find a reason for suspicion. Her fingers hesitated over the keyboard. "We don't usually see passengers like..." Reynolds started but stopped herself. Her face tightened, as though realizing she had said too much. Sasha felt her stomach twist. Passengers like what? The unspoken words hung between them. Reynolds straightened abruptly. "Just verifying everything is in order," she muttered. Sasha bit her tongue, willing herself to remain calm. She wasn't going to make a scene. Not over this. But when Reynolds called over another agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a sharp jawline and an unreadable expression, Sasha's patience began to fray. The man, J. Keller, walked up and took the ticket and ID from Reynolds. His eyes flickered to Sasha, then back to the documents. He scanned them slowly, methodically, as if looking for something to justify the delay. "This ticket is for business class," he stated, his voice laced with suspicion. Sasha exhaled sharply. "I know." Keller exchanged a glance with Reynolds, something unsaid passing between them. Something Sasha wasn't meant to see. Finally, Keller gave a reluctant nod. "Fine. Go ahead." Sasha snatched her ticket and ID from the counter, jaw clenched. What was that about? She wasn't naive. She had seen this kind of thing before, but she wasn't going to let two rude employees ruin her morning. She turned and walked away, ignoring the way the two agents watched her as she left. The security checkpoint, a random selection. The TSA line was long but moved at a steady pace. Sasha placed her backpack and laptop on the conveyor belt, stepping forward to pass through the metal detector. She had done this 100 times before. The green light flashed. She had passed through without issue. Then, just as she reached for her bag, a voice stopped her. "Excuse me, ma'am. Step to the side, please." Sasha turned to see a TSA agent, a man with an authoritative stance and cold, assessing eyes. She frowned. "Is there a problem?" "It's just a random check," the agent said. Sasha's pulse quickened. Another delay. Another scrutiny. She wanted to believe it really was random, but after the encounter at check-in, the pieces didn't fit. She didn't argue. Instead, she stepped aside, watching as another TSA agent rummaged through her bag. They pulled out her laptop, flipping it over, running their fingers along the edges like she was hiding something. Then came the pat-down, far more intrusive than necessary. "Where are you traveling?" the male agent asked. "New York," Sasha said, her patience wearing thin. "Business or pleasure?" Sasha clenched her jaw. "Business." The man smirked slightly. "Fancy business trip if you're flying business class." Sasha's breath caught in her throat. There it was. She inhaled sharply, forcing herself to remain composed. They wanted a reaction. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. The search dragged on until, finally, the agent stepped back. "You're good to go." Sasha grabbed her things and walked away, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was more than just bad luck. They had singled her out. But it wasn't over yet. The final insult. As she neared her departure gate, she noticed something unusual. A group of airline staff whispering, their eyes darting toward her. Something was wrong. One of them, a woman with a sharp face and an air of authority, approached. "Miss Obama, I need to see your ticket and ID again." Sasha hesitated before handing them over. The woman examined them, then looked up, her expression unreadable. "I'm sorry," she said, "but we cannot allow you to board this flight." Sasha's heart stopped. "What?" The woman's voice was final, cold, unapologetic. "You'll need to leave the airport." For a moment, Sasha couldn't move, couldn't speak. Humiliation flooded her. This wasn't just about her ticket anymore. This was personal. She clenched her fists. Then, slowly, she pulled out her phone and dialed. Her father. "Dad," she said, her voice shaking. "I need you." And on the other end of the line, Barack Obama's voice was calm, steady, but dangerous. "I'm on my way." The weight of a name. The air around Sasha felt heavier as she lowered her phone, her fingers tightening around the device, as though it could shield her from the burning humiliation that crawled up her spine. Her heart pounded against her ribs, an erratic drumbeat of anger, disbelief, and something else, something colder. She wasn't just frustrated. She was furious. And yet, she stood still, her breath controlled, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. She had seen her parents handle crisis too many times to let her emotions get the best of her now. The airline staffer, the one who had delivered the final blow, stood with her arms crossed, the badge on her uniform catching the harsh airport lighting. Her name tag read K. Morris. There was no apology in her expression, no sign that she thought twice about what she had just done. To her, Sasha was just another problem to remove from the airport as quickly as possible. Sasha had seen that look before, the quiet dismissal, the unspoken assumption that she didn't belong where she was. Sasha swallowed down the bitterness threatening to rise in her throat. And why, exactly, can I not board my flight? Her voice was measured, careful, but every syllable carried the weight of her growing anger. Morris didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. Your ticket has been flagged due to an irregularity. For security reasons, we cannot permit you to fly today. Sasha stared at her, searching her face for any sign that she was lying. And irregularity? What irregularity? She had purchased the ticket herself, used her own money, entered her own information, followed every step just like anyone else would. There was no issue with the ticket. There had never been. And irregularity? Sasha repeated, making sure she didn't let even a hint of doubt creep into her voice. I checked in without a problem. I passed security after an unnecessary secondary screening. You've searched my bag, delayed me, questioned me. And now, suddenly, I'm not allowed to board because of an irregularity. Morris didn't blink. I don't make the rules, Miss Obama. There it was again. That tone, that dismissiveness. Sasha recognized it for what it was. She had spent her entire life watching how people reacted to her family, how they either tiptoed around the power of their name or tried to diminish it completely. Right now, she was dealing with the latter. They had already decided she didn't belong, and no explanation would change that. Sasha exhaled sharply, steadying herself. I'd like to speak with your supervisor, she said, her voice firm. Morris lifted a single brow, but before she could respond, Sasha heard footsteps approaching rapidly. She turned her head just as 3 airport security guards came into view, their postures tense, their hands hovering near the radios clipped to their belts. One of them, an older man with graying hair and sharp eyes, stepped forward. Miss, we're going to have to ask you to leave, he said without preamble, his voice carrying the weight of an order rather than a request. Sasha's hands curled into fists at her sides. On what grounds? His lips pressed into a thin line. We have the right to refuse service to anyone causing a disturbance. You've been flagged for removal. Please cooperate. Sasha's breath caught. A disturbance. The only thing she had done was ask questions. That was enough for them to decide she was a problem. She forced herself to remain calm, but her pulse hammered wildly against her skin. She was being pushed out, deliberately and systematically. They had escalated it to the point where she was no longer just an inconvenient passenger asking too many questions. She was now a security threat in their eyes. Sasha inhaled deeply, controlling the fire in her chest. She didn't move. I am not leaving until I speak with someone in charge. The gray-haired officer stepped closer, his presence looming. Miss Obama, if you do not leave voluntarily, we will have to escort you out. Escort, a polished word for forcefully remove. Something in Sasha's stomach turned, but she met his gaze without blinking. She refused to let them intimidate her. My father is on his way, she said, each word slow and deliberate. If you remove me before he arrives, you'll be answering to him directly. The moment the words left her mouth, she saw a shift, not in the guards, not in Morris, but in the surrounding crowd. People were watching now, their murmurs growing louder. Some were pulling out their phones. Sasha could see it in their faces. Recognition. Her last name had power, whether they wanted to admit it or not. One of the guards hesitated, his fingers twitching near his radio. He wasn't sure if he wanted to be the guy caught on camera forcibly removing Barack Obama's daughter from an airport for no legitimate reason. But the gray-haired officer didn't flinch. If anything, his jaw tightened. Sasha understood then. He didn't care who she was. But the airport did. And that was why Morris suddenly turned to the guard and muttered, "Stand down." The order was quiet, but it carried finality. The guards hesitated, then stepped back. Sasha didn't react. She stood her ground, waiting. Because she could already see what was coming next. The change in the air was almost tangible. The way people's eyes widened, The way the guards suddenly straightened, the way the entire energy of the airport shifted. Footsteps. Measured, purposeful, authoritative. And then a voice. "Miss Obama, are you all right?" Her father had arrived. Part 3. The power of presence. The moment Barack Obama stepped into view, the energy around them shifted. The tension, once thick with quiet hostility, was now laced with something sharper. Uncertainty. He wasn't just a former president. He was a man who understood power and how to wield it without ever raising his voice. For the first time since she had arrived at the airport, Sasha felt like she had a shield. Barack walked toward her, his steps unhurried, his expression unreadable. He was dressed simply, dark slacks, a crisp navy jacket, and an air of calm command that made the guards instinctively straighten. When he reached Sasha, he placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder before turning his gaze toward the airline staff. The room, which had been so loud just moments ago, had fallen completely silent. Morris shifted uncomfortably under his stare, but forced herself to maintain composure. "Mr. Obama," she started, her voice thin with forced professionalism, "we were just following protocol." Barack's voice cut through the air, smooth and sharp. "Explain to me exactly what protocol justifies publicly humiliating my daughter, subjecting her to multiple unnecessary screenings, confiscating her belongings, and then banning her from boarding a flight without cause." Morris faltered. No one spoke. Sasha didn't move. She only watched as the people who had tried to strip away her dignity now scrambled to find words in the presence of the man they never expected to face. Because now this wasn't just about an inconvenient passenger. It was about the former President of the United States standing in the middle of Reagan National Airport, demanding an explanation. And for the first time that morning, Sasha knew she would get one. The reckoning at Reagan National. A suffocating silence hung over the terminal. The same staff who had been so quick to dismiss Sasha now looked as though they wanted to melt into the walls. The security guards who had stood firm, ready to escort her out, suddenly seemed to shrink in their uniforms. And Morris, the woman who had so confidently barred Sasha from her flight, had the expression of someone who had just realized they had made the biggest mistake of their career. Barack Obama stood tall, his posture calm but commanding, his eyes locked onto the staff members who had orchestrated his daughter's humiliation. There was no need for raised voices or exaggerated gestures. His mere presence shifted the entire balance of power in the room. He had not come in like a storm, but his words carried the weight of thunder. "I asked a question," he said again, his voice steady, measured, and yet carrying an unmistakable edge of authority that made even the airport's busiest workers pause to listen. "What protocol allows my daughter to be singled out, searched, interrogated, and then denied the right to board her flight?" Morris straightened slightly, clearly scrambling for a response that wouldn't crumble under scrutiny. "Sir, No." Barack cut her off, his gaze sharp. "I don't want excuses. I want facts." Sasha, standing beside him, remained quiet, though the tension in her shoulders had eased slightly. She wasn't alone anymore. The battle had shifted, and she could see it in the way every staff member, every passenger in the area, had now turned their attention to Barack Obama. Morris swallowed hard, her confidence visibly cracking under the weight of the moment. Her ticket was flagged as irregular. "Flagged by whom?" Barack asked, his voice pressing, demanding. The woman hesitated. It was brought to our attention by security personnel." Barack turned slightly, his gaze landing on the gray-haired security officer who had been the most aggressive. "Is that true?" The officer shifted on his feet. He seemed to realize, too late, that there was no easy way out of this conversation. "We conduct additional screenings when there are concerns about security risks," he finally said, his voice gruff but slightly less certain than before. Barack's expression didn't change. "And my daughter, who went through TSA security without issue, who had a valid ticket and ID, who followed every single step of your protocol, was considered a security risk." The officer said nothing. Barack exhaled through his nose, his patience thinning. Or did you all simply decide that she didn't belong in business class? Sasha watched as Morris's face drained of color, her lips pressing into a thin, bloodless line. The accusation lingered in the air, undeniable and sharp. The tension thickened as Barak's words settled over the group. The security officers avoided his gaze. The whispers among the gathered crowd grew louder. "Sir," Morris finally spoke again, her voice lower now, more controlled, as if trying to minimize the damage already done. "This was a misunderstanding." Barak let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "A misunderstanding." He shook his head, but there was no amusement in his expression. "You call multiple invasive searches, repeated interrogations, and public humiliation a misunderstanding. If I hadn't arrived here, were you planning to leave my daughter stranded? To treat her like a criminal because you didn't think she looked the part?" Morris had no answer. None of them did. Barak shifted, glancing down at Sasha for the first time since arriving. His gaze softened slightly, but there was still a quiet storm behind his eyes. "Sasha, are you okay?" She swallowed, nodding. "I'm fine." She wasn't. Not entirely. But she refused to let them see her break. Barak nodded once before turning his attention back to the staff. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, his voice now taking on that calculated, presidential authority that had once commanded entire nations. "My daughter will be getting on her flight. Immediately. No more delays. No more questioning. And I want the names of every single person involved in this disgraceful display of bias, because I assure you," he exhaled slowly, "this is far from over." A sharp silence followed. Morris looked like she wanted to argue, but she must have seen the way the passengers were watching, filming, whispering. The tide had turned against her. "I understand, sir," she finally muttered, stepping back. "We'll accommodate her immediately." Sasha didn't move at first. She could still feel the sting of humiliation in her chest, could still hear the mocking tone of the TSA officer who had smirked at her during the screening. The unfairness of it all left a bitter taste in her mouth. But her father was right. The fight wasn't over. She lifted her chin, letting the weight of her last name settle on her shoulders. This time, instead of feeling suffocated by it, she let it empower her. "Let's go," Barak said, gently guiding her toward the gate. The security officers stepped aside without another word. The passengers, many of whom had been silently observing, now openly clapped. Sasha's eyes widened slightly at the unexpected support, but she didn't react. Instead, she walked forward, her father at her side. For the first time that morning, she felt like she was walking with dignity intact. The aftermath. A storm brewing. They didn't board immediately. The airline had already delayed the flight, probably to avoid a PR disaster. But it gave Sasha and Barak a moment to sit, breathe, and process what had just happened. Barak's phone buzzed constantly. His team, journalists, officials, everyone had already caught wind of the situation. Sasha sat beside him in a secluded lounge near the gate, sipping the hot tea he had insisted she take to calm her nerves. The warmth did little to melt the frustration in her chest. "You're quiet," Barak observed, watching her carefully. Sasha exhaled, her fingers tightening around the cup. "I'm still mad." Her father nodded, as if he understood entirely. And of course he did. "Good," he said simply. "Stay mad, but don't let it consume you. Let it fuel something bigger." Sasha glanced at him, something flickering in her gaze. "They're going to try to bury this," she muttered. Barak's lips quirked up slightly, but there was no amusement in his eyes. "They can try," he said, "but they won't succeed." And he was right. By the time their plane took off, the story had already spread like wildfire. Social media was ablaze with footage of the confrontation. News outlets had begun calling for statements. Civil rights advocates were already demanding answers. And within hours, Reagan National Airport, TSA, and the airline were all scrambling to contain the fallout. But Sasha didn't want containment. She wanted change. And after today, She was more determined than ever to make sure no one else ever had to feel what she had felt in that airport. Her fight had just begun. The fallout begins. The private lounge where Sasha and Barack Obama sat was quiet, but the energy around them was anything but. The terminal outside was buzzing with whispers, glances, and a growing awareness of what had just taken place. The security officers and airline staff, who had dismissed Sasha earlier, were no longer in sight, likely pulled into frantic meetings with higher-ups, desperate to salvage the situation before it spiraled even further. But it was already too late. Barack had spent decades navigating the intricate dance of politics, media, and public perception, and he could already tell what was happening. The footage taken by passengers was making the rounds on social media, and the public had begun dissecting every detail, from the way Sasha had been questioned at check-in to the smug look on the TSA agent's face as he called her a security risk. He glanced down at his phone, scanning the messages pouring in. His team was already working to control the narrative, but this wasn't something that could be contained. It was going to explode, and that was exactly what needed to happen. Sasha, sitting beside him, had her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She wasn't fuming anymore, but there was a hardened resolve in her posture. Barack had seen that look before, on his wife, on himself, on every person who had ever been forced to confront injustice head-on. "Tell me what happens next," Sasha finally said, breaking the silence. Barack set his phone down on the small table between them. He wasn't going to sugarcoat it. "First, they'll issue an apology, something vague, something safe. We regret the incident. We take these matters seriously. The usual corporate damage control," he said, watching her reaction carefully. "Then, they'll launch an internal investigation. That'll buy them time. Maybe they'll fire a few people, suspend some staff, but ultimately, they'll hope this dies down in a few weeks." Sasha scoffed under her breath. She had heard this story before. "And will it?" she asked, her voice carrying a sharp edge. Barack leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped together. "Not if we don't let it." That was the difference. The people who had mistreated her weren't expecting a fight. They had assumed Sasha would accept their authority, swallow her humiliation, and disappear. They hadn't counted on her father showing up. And more importantly, they hadn't counted on her not backing down. "They don't get to pretend this was a misunderstanding," Sasha said, her voice steady but firm. "They didn't just make a mistake. They made a choice to treat me like I didn't belong." Barack nodded. "And that's why we push back." Sasha exhaled, shaking her head. "I don't just want them to apologize. I want them to explain. I want them to admit why they thought I was suspicious, why I was searched, why my ticket was questioned, why I was kicked out of an airport like I was a criminal when I did nothing wrong." Barack watched her for a moment, then reached for his phone. He tapped a few numbers and lifted it to his ear. "Ben," he said after a moment, "we're going to release a statement." Sasha listened as her father outlined the first step in their plan. This wouldn't be a simple news story. It wouldn't fade into the background like countless other incidents. This time, there would be consequences. The internet explodes. By the time their plane touched down in New York, the entire country was talking about what had happened. #JusticeForSasha was trending on Twitter. News anchors were dissecting every available detail, political commentators were weighing in, and civil rights organizations were demanding answers. The footage had gone viral. Sasha's voice, calm yet firm, asking why she was being removed. The smug TSA agent dismissing her. The moment Barack Obama walked in and shifted the entire power dynamic in the room. It was a story that touched a nerve because it was familiar. Too many people had experienced something similar, being singled out, scrutinized, questioned, or treated as though they didn't belong simply because of their race, their background, or someone else's assumptions. People started coming forward with their own experiences. Former airport employees anonymously confirmed that racial profiling wasn't just an accident. It was part of the unspoken culture in many airports. And then came the real bombshell. A leaked internal memo from Reagan National Airport surfaced on the internet. The memo, dated just weeks before the incident, contained guidelines for heightened security awareness and included a section on behavioral assessments. But hidden within the bureaucratic language was something far more damning: a list of indicators for potential security threats, with specific mentions of young minority travelers, individuals who appear out of place in certain sections, and those who exhibit an unusual level of confidence when questioned. The implications were clear. Sasha hadn't been removed because of an irregularity with her ticket. She had been removed because someone looked at her and decided she didn't fit their idea of what a business-class passenger should look like. That memo changed everything. The fallout begins. With the memo leaked, the apologies from the airline, TSA, and the airport came fast and desperate. "We deeply regret the handling of this situation and recognize the need for immediate action. We do not tolerate discrimination in our security processes. We will be implementing new training programs to ensure all employees understand our commitment to fairness and respect for all passengers." But it wasn't enough. Barak and Sasha weren't just going to let them release a statement and move on. Barak's former administration officials, civil rights lawyers, and activists were already mobilizing. He had connections that could force real change, and he was prepared to use every single one of them. And Sasha? She had her own voice. She had already been invited to speak at a major social justice panel in New York. What was supposed to be a conversation about youth activism had now turned into a high-profile discussion on systemic bias and discrimination in public spaces. She had planned to talk about community initiatives and local organizing. Now, she was going to stand on that stage and tell the world exactly what happened to her. The system starts to shake. Within days, multiple TSA agents at Reagan National Airport were placed on administrative leave. The airline launched a formal investigation. A congressional subcommittee announced it would be reviewing TSA screening practices. Sasha sat in her hotel room in New York, watching the news as the dominoes began to fall. And yet, even with all the progress, the fight wasn't over. She turned to her father, who was standing near the window, scrolling through his emails. "You think this is enough?" she asked. Barak exhaled, setting his phone down. He turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "It's a start," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "But change doesn't happen overnight." Sasha nodded slowly, understanding what he meant. She wasn't just a victim of a bad experience at an airport. She wasn't just someone who had been wronged. She was someone who had been given a platform. And she intended to use it. A fire that won't burn out. The morning sun barely seeped through the curtains of Sasha Obama's hotel room in New York, but she had been awake long before it rose. She sat at the small table near the window, a steaming cup of tea in front of her, untouched. The city hummed with life below, taxis honking, distant voices rising in a chorus of urgency. Yet inside the room, it was silent, save for the quiet tapping of her fingers against the glass tabletop. The news was everywhere. It had only been 24 hours since she and her father had landed in New York, and yet the fallout from her experience at Reagan National Airport had already reached Congress, major news networks, and social justice groups worldwide. Headlines flooded every major news outlet. TSA under fire after incident involving Sasha Obama. Airport security procedures face new scrutiny after discrimination claims. Former President Obama demands transparency following daughter's airport ordeal. And then there was the social media storm. The video of her being stopped, interrogated, and eventually banned from boarding her flight had millions of views. The moment her father had arrived, the calm but unshakable force he had brought with him, was now a symbol of power against injustice. But Sasha wasn't thinking about the headlines. She wasn't thinking about the thousands of comments flooding her inbox, or even the support pouring in from activists, politicians, and public figures. She was thinking about the people whose names weren't in the headlines, the ones who didn't have fathers who could walk into a room and command attention, the ones who had been humiliated, profiled, and mistreated in airports, but had no cameras recording them. No news outlets demanding justice on their behalf. How many times had this happened before? How many times had someone been told they weren't supposed to be in first class? How many times had someone been pulled aside because they looked suspicious or didn't belong? She inhaled sharply, pushing back the frustration creeping into her chest. This wasn't about her anymore. This was about everyone who had ever been in her place. She picked up her phone, scrolling through messages until she landed on one from Ben Rhodes, her father's former deputy national security advisor. Ben, morning, Sasha. I know you've been getting a lot of requests for interviews, but I think there's something bigger here. Civil rights leaders want to meet. Let me know if you're up for it. Her grip tightened around the phone. She had two choices. She could let this be just another story that flares up and dies down. A moment of outrage that would eventually be replaced by the next big controversy. Or she could make sure this wasn't forgotten. She took a deep breath before typing her response. Sasha, set it up. I want to hear what they have to say. The meeting that changed everything. The conference room inside the Thurgood Marshall Center for Civil Rights in Harlem was filled with some of the most respected voices in the fight for racial and social justice. The air was thick with expectation as Sasha and Barack Obama stepped inside, their presence met with nods of acknowledgement from activists, community leaders, and legal experts who had been on the front lines of civil rights work for decades. At the head of the table sat Dr. Ava Richardson, a seasoned attorney who had spent years battling discrimination cases in the transportation sector. Beside her was James Cole, a former Justice Department official who had been involved in policy reforms during Barack's presidency. Across from them sat Maya Williams, a young activist who had founded an organization dedicated to documenting incidents of racial profiling in airports. Barack took his seat, his expression composed but attentive. Sasha sat beside him, her shoulders squared, ready to listen. Dr. Richardson was the first to speak. What happened to Sasha isn't new, she said, her voice calm but laced with quiet anger. It happens every day. The only difference is, this time, they did it to someone who had the power to fight back. Maya Williams leaned forward, her hands folded. We've been compiling data for years. The patterns are undeniable. Black and brown travelers are disproportionately flagged for additional screening. There's no real oversight on how random checks are conducted. And now, with the leaked TSA memo, we have proof that these so-called security procedures are coded in bias. James Cole nodded. The TSA and airlines have been operating with almost unchecked authority when it comes to profiling passengers. Complaints are dismissed. Reports get buried. This could be the moment to force real change. Sasha listened carefully, absorbing every word. What would that change look like? She asked. Ava Richardson didn't hesitate. Accountability. We need an independent review board to oversee TSA complaints. We need policy changes that require detailed justification for additional screenings. We need transparency in how passengers are flagged. And we need consequences for employees who abuse their authority. Sasha exchanged a look with her father. Barack's expression remained unreadable, but she knew his mind was already working through the strategy. We can put pressure on the administration, Barack said. Call for congressional hearings. Push for TSA reform. James nodded. We've already had 2 members of Congress reach out. If this gains momentum, we could see actual legislative changes. Sasha's heart pounded. This was bigger than she had imagined. This wasn't just about fighting for an apology. This was about fighting for an entire system to be held accountable. She straightened in her chair. Then let's do it. The government steps in. The pressure on TSA and Reagan National Airport intensified. Within days, lawmakers called for a formal investigation. The Department of Transportation released a statement acknowledging that Sasha's case had brought to light serious concerns about profiling practices. Then, the White House weighed in. Press Secretary Emily Harris stood at the podium in the briefing room, cameras flashing as reporters pressed her for answers. The president has been briefed on the incident involving Ms. Obama, she said carefully, choosing her words with precision. He believes every traveler deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, and he supports efforts to review TSA policies to ensure fairness in airport security screenings. That single statement sent shockwaves through Washington. This was no longer just a scandal, it was a policy issue. The head of TSA was summoned to testify before Congress. Lawmakers began drafting proposed legislation that would require stricter oversight of security screenings. And behind the scenes, Barack Obama made calls that could not be ignored. But the biggest moment came when Sasha herself spoke. At a nationally televised town hall on racial bias in public spaces, she took the stage in front of thousands. "I am not here just because of what happened to me," she told the audience. "I am here because of what happens to people every day who don't have cameras recording them, who don't have someone powerful to call, who don't get justice. And I refuse to let this be just another moment that people forget." The applause was thunderous. She wasn't just Barack Obama's daughter. She was a fighter. And she wasn't going anywhere. The legacy rewritten. The room was silent as Sasha Obama stepped up to the podium. The grand hall of the National Civil Rights Town Hall was packed to the brim. Activists, policymakers, community leaders, and citizens who had followed every step of her battle against racial profiling in airports. The weight of a movement pressed against her chest, but she stood firm, her chin lifted, her voice steady. Cameras lined the back of the hall, live streams broadcasting her image across the nation. She wasn't speaking just for herself anymore. She was speaking for the countless voices that had been ignored, dismissed, and silenced for too long. She took a deep breath, gripping the edges of the podium for support. "I never thought I'd be standing here today," she began, her voice resonating through the vast space. "A few weeks ago, I was just another traveler, doing what millions of people do every single day, getting on a plane to go to work. I had a valid ticket, I had followed every rule, and yet I was treated like a suspect. I was questioned, searched, humiliated, and ultimately told that I didn't belong." She let her words settle, scanning the audience. There was no turning back now. "This isn't just about what happened to me. This is about what has been happening to people for years. People who have been pulled aside at security because they look suspicious. People who have been denied their rights, their dignity, their freedom to move through the world without being treated as criminals simply because of how they look. We've all heard the excuses. It was a mistake. It was just a security measure. It was a misunderstanding. But what happened to me wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a choice." She tightened her grip on the podium. "It was a choice made by employees who assumed I didn't belong in business class. It was a choice made by security officers who thought I was lying about my own ticket. It was a choice made by an entire system that has spent decades allowing discrimination to happen in the name of security. And if we don't fight back, if we don't demand change, then it will keep happening." The crowd was hanging on to her every word, some nodding, some already recording, some barely holding back their emotions. She inhaled deeply, steadying herself. "We cannot allow this system to continue unchecked. We cannot accept the idea that some people will always have to prove that they belong. This is bigger than me. This is about every person who has ever been told that their presence is a threat before they've even spoken a word. It's about every traveler who has been pulled aside, every business person who has been doubted, every student who has been interrogated for daring to sit in first class." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the audience. "My father always told me that true change doesn't happen because one person demands it. It happens because millions of people refuse to stay silent. We have that moment right now. We have a chance to make sure that no one else has to go through what I went through. And I am not going to let this moment pass without action." Applause erupted, not polite clapping, but thunderous, standing ovation applause. The kind that shook the room, that sent vibrations through the floor, that carried a promise of change. Sasha stepped back from the podium, her hands shaking slightly, but she felt lighter, stronger, because she had spoken her truth, and the world had listened. A chain reaction of change. By the time Sasha left the stage, The impact of her speech had already begun to unfold. News outlets blasted her words across their headlines. Social media exploded with reactions. Public figures, from politicians to celebrities, voiced their support. But the biggest shift came from Washington, D.C. The pressure that had been building finally cracked through the walls of power. 2 days after her speech, a congressional hearing was officially scheduled. The head of the TSA and representatives from the Department of Transportation were called to testify. They were forced to answer questions on national television about racial profiling in airport security. Under the glare of public scrutiny, they had no choice but to admit what had long been suspected, that racial bias existed in their processes, that random screenings weren't always random, that there was a pattern of targeting black and brown travelers. Legislation was drafted almost immediately. The Fair Travel Act, a bill designed to bring real accountability to airport security practices. Mandatory anti-bias training for all TSA employees. A national oversight committee to review complaints against security officers. Stricter policies on how passengers are flagged for additional screening. The bill gained bipartisan support, a rare moment of unity in a divided Congress. It was clear that this wasn't just a political issue anymore. It was a civil rights issue. And the momentum didn't stop there. Major airlines began announcing their own internal reviews of security practices. Several TSA agents involved in Sasha's case were fired or placed on permanent leave. Reagan National Airport issued a formal, public apology. But most importantly, people started speaking out. The thousands of messages Sasha received weren't just words of support. They were stories. Stories from people who had been told to step aside for extra questioning every time they flew. Stories from women who had been interrogated about why they were flying alone. Stories from students who had been told their tickets were too expensive for someone like them. Sasha read every single one, and she made a decision. A future of advocacy. It wasn't enough to push for change from a distance. Sasha wanted to be part of the solution. Within weeks, she announced the launch of an organization, a watchdog group focused on fighting discrimination in travel and public spaces, a place where passengers could report incidents, where legal teams could advocate for real consequences, where policies could be challenged before they became another statistic. She wasn't stepping into her father's shadow. She was creating her own legacy. And the world was ready for it. The conversation that changed everything. One evening, after weeks of non-stop meetings, interviews, and advocacy, Sasha sat across from her father in a quiet restaurant. The whirlwind of events had left them both exhausted, but neither of them regretted a single step of this fight. Barack watched her carefully, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then, finally, he smiled. A slow, proud smile. "You know," he said, setting his fork down. "I always knew you'd end up fighting for something bigger than yourself." Sasha exhaled, leaning back in her chair. "I didn't plan for this, Dad." He chuckled softly. No one ever plans for their defining moments. They just happen. And we either step up or we don't. He tilted his head, studying her. "And you stepped up." Sasha thought about that. Thought about everything that had happened since that day at the airport. The humiliation, the frustration, the moment her father had walked in and turned the tables. The anger she had felt, the fear, the determination. "I didn't have a choice," she finally said. Barack shook his head. "There's always a choice." His eyes softened. "And you made the right one." Sasha looked down at her hands, letting the weight of everything settle over her. She wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. She was fighting for change. And she wasn't going to stop. Not now. Not ever.